Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. After hearing some similar stories on a few forums that I follow, I felt compelled to share an experience that I had as a child. This happened when I went to my friend Brody's birthday party around the age of 11. Brody and I were pretty decent friends at that time. We hung out after school at each other's houses before, but it was usually at mine. That was typically both of our preferences, thanks to his older brother. Brody had a brother that I'll call Chad that was around 16 at the time of this event. Chad was a complete ass. He bullied not only Brody, but any of his friends that he had over, including me. He would barge into his room when we were in there, make remarks about us, throw things at us, and then leave. He even on occasion would try to do things physically to us, like if we were walking by. Like he would stick his leg out to trip us, smack us in the back of our head, or push our head down on the table as he walked by. It didn't matter to him as long as he had some way to bully us. And if he wasn't afraid to do it to me, I'm sure he treated Brody's other friends the same way. The only time that he didn't really do this was when his mom was around. She wouldn't tolerate it and would immediately stop him, yell at him, and whatever she had to do to make him stop. And needless to say, when she was home, I preferred to be in the same room as her. For the party, Brody's mom was renting out the local community center to have the party, which meant more people and more opportunities to get lost in the crowd of people. There were probably about 20 kids or so that showed up, and most parents stayed around too. My parents had dropped me off and left, and after a few hours and all the games being played and cake being eaten, we started coming up with our own games to play. One of those was a version of tag where one person is it, but if they start chasing you, you have to call out someone else's name so they chase them instead. So as we started playing this, who else walks in but Chad and two of his friends? I know, I was pretty disappointed in this, but the fact that a few of our mutual friends had the same reaction told me everything that I needed to know. He came over to us, grabbed Brody by the head, and told him happy birthday. Then he asked what we were playing. When we told him, he said he wanted to play too. My fear was that he was going to ask to be it, and one of us was going to get seriously hurt. I was half right. Surprisingly, he didn't ask to be it, but he and his friends got in the circle with us, and we all began. Our friend that was it started chasing someone else, and as my attention is on the friend being chased, I failed to notice Chad approach me until I had the wind knocked out of me. I fell to the ground, trying to figure out what happened, when I suddenly felt a bunch of pressure on my back. Once I can finally breathe again, I realized that the pressure was someone on my back, like sitting on me or holding me down. Chad then got on his knees, with his head on the floor looking at me with an ugly and creepy grin. I tried fighting to get up, but the one on my back had a hold of my arm and was twisting it back. I was in excruciating pain from my arm and to my face and my stomach, and I was already having trouble breathing. And just when I think I'm probably just going to get beat up, I see Chad bring a little pocket knife up to my face, and he asked me if I wanted a party favor. I started screaming. Then I heard other kids screaming and crying. At the same time, Brody was letting out these horrible cries for help, but I didn't know what to do. I could tell he was scared, and hell, I was scared too. We were only 10 and 11 years old. We were not a threat to 3 16-year-olds. Thankfully, after what felt like an eternity, I heard Brody's mom yelling for Chad to get off of me. I could see his face instantly change. He tried to scramble to his feet, all the while hiding the knife. However, he didn't do a very good job, because the way he stood up and slid his hand back, he still ended up cutting part of my neck and chin. And once he was up, I got to my feet as well, holding my face from the pain. His mom yelled at him and made him and his friends leave immediately, which they did. She then rushed me to the restroom to help clean up my face, but I could tell by the look on her face that it wasn't good. She kept apologizing to me and hugging me with tears in her eyes. I was only 11, but man, I felt so sorry for her. She was always such a kind lady, and Brody was always chill too. I never understood why or how Chad turned out the way he did. And once we finished in the restroom, she brought me back out to the others and asked me to stay by her so she could call my parents. They came and picked me up shortly after and then took me to the hospital. I had to get 8 stitches. That night was pretty crappy after that. My mom was pissed about the whole thing, as I remember her blaming Brody's mom for not paying attention, but she wasn't even at the party. I tried to tell her that he wasn't at the party at the start and he just showed up, so I don't think he was supposed to be there, but it didn't matter to her. She thought the right thing to do was to press charges against Chad. Thankfully, that didn't really go anywhere, and his mom settled it by agreeing to pay the hospital bills. I may have been a kid at that time, but as an adult now, I don't really feel like that was the best course of action. But I also don't really talk to my mom anymore. That may be related, who knows. Unfortunately, this definitely strained the friendship between Brody and I. I wasn't allowed to be over there anymore, and anytime I asked if he could come over, there was always a reason why he couldn't. Because of this, we hung out at school, but that was it, and we slowly drifted apart until we eventually moved on and I completely lost touch with him. I really feel bad for Brody because I'm afraid I probably wasn't the only friend he lost because of his brother. Chad, just for some reason, was evil and still have no idea why. All I know is that I have a permanent scar on my chin and large gatherings still kind of scare me. But I hope Brody and his mom are doing okay. And I hope Chad got whatever kind of help he needed. And I hope that I never meet him again. This isn't really creepy, but it was scary for sure. I know I am not the parent in this situation, but rather the kid. This was, who knows, years ago. I was young, maybe like 7 or 8, and I was with my 2 other siblings, my little brother and older sister. We were all 3 years apart. Anyways, we were all in the car waiting for our mom, who had gone inside a Pizza Delight to pick up our food, which she had pre-ordered beforehand. This was in Bayers Lake, I think. We were only alone in there for a minute, and I was tired, so I was half asleep against the window. I was abruptly woken up to aggressive and loud banging on our car window. My sister, maybe 10 at that time, was sitting shotgun. I was in the back seat diagonal from her, and my little brother, probably 4, was beside me. We all immediately looked to where the sound came from and saw a 40 to 50-year-old looking lady. I don't remember much about her, and it was late out, but her hair was kind of frizzy, thin, and crazy looking. It was silvery blonde, and she had a receding hairline and was sweating profusely on her forehead. She looked a little on the heavy side, and her face was practically pressed up against the glass, and she had an intense, crazy look. She held her phone up against the window, my sister's window, with a white emergency dial screen up, and then she yelled something at us. I can't remember what it was, and my mom was literally walking back to the car when this happened, and she was like, "What the hell?" So she immediately gets into the car, and the woman runs around to her door and then grabs it, yelling at her how she's a terrible person for leaving her kids alone in a car and that she was going to call CPS. Our mom explains to her that she was only gone for 5 minutes max, and that she had a 10-year-old in the car with a phone, and that the car was locked, and that she could see the car from where she was in the restaurant. But the lady kept screaming at my mom though, and then she grabs my mom's wrist. So, my mom, who is in the military, immediately rips her hand off her wrist and then slams her door shut, rolls down the window to give her the bird, and then books it. The woman was screaming the whole time and looked genuinely insane and terrifying. Anyways, we later dubbed her Pizza Karen around 2020 when we were reminiscing about the event, and we laugh about it now. But yeah, that's my story. A few years ago, I don't remember exactly when, my husband and I were talking about random things, and I remember that it was mentioned that I had never actually been camping. Like, I had camped in my own backyard as a kid, but I had never had an actual camping trip. This was apparently the wrong thing to have mentioned to him, because within the week, we were making plans. Or more so, he was making plans to have a camping trip within the month. We went all out on it too. He found a nearby campground that wasn't expensive. He bought all the equipment, and he got everything ready to go in what felt like a couple of days. So the day came for us to get on the road and get to the campground. We packed up all our clothes and daily items, got the stuff in the car, and then headed out. I admit, I have never been much of a nature lover. As a kid, I was more into staying inside and playing with my Nintendo than going out on a hiking or swimming or whatever. Yeah, I know that sounds like a boring childhood, but it was mine and it was what I liked. So, needless to say, when we got to the actual campground and it was nothing but empty space and trees, I was a bit enamored. It was gorgeous. He had found a spot that was near a small waterfall that was over a small pool of water. On top of that, it was pretty isolated, in that there were no campers anywhere near our spot. Once we got our tent set up and were confident that we were good to go, I was super excited and I was eager to take a hike around the area. I had brought my digital camera and I wanted to get some pictures of anything and everything that we could, and I absolutely did. We walked around and I got pictures of some wildflowers, I got a few shots of birds, and even got a picture of a deer. As we were hiking, we ended up in a small section of trees that looked like it had been recently cleared out, like someone had been staying there in a tent or something and had recently left. As we approached the cleared out section, the smell of something dead hit me, and hard. It didn't take long to figure out where the smell was coming from. Nearby, we found the carcass of a deer that looked like it had been killed, bled, and then partially eaten, but then left to rot. It made me a bit sick, but my husband looked pretty angry and mentioned that it's actually illegal to leave your kills like that and that we should go back to our spot and then report it to the game warden. When we got back, I let him do all that since I had no idea about any of it. I hopped into the tent and I started going through all my pictures that I have taken. I was actually super happy with how things were going, well, minus the dead animal. And after he had gotten done talking to the game warden, he mentioned that we should consider turning in since it was getting late, and I agreed with him. We stayed up for a little while and just kind of enjoyed each other's company. And after a couple of hours, I started dozing off, so he zipped up the tent and we decided to sleep for the night. Then, after a few hours, I was awoken by the strangest thing. Rain hitting my face. At first, I didn't think anything of it. We were out in the woods and sleeping in a tent after all. But then it hit me. Yes, we were in a tent, but the tent was sealed and there shouldn't be any water coming in at all. My eyes shot open and I immediately freaked out. The door to our tent was completely unzipped and open. I shook my husband awake and I told him that the tent door was open. At first, he thought that we must have left it open. Then I explained to him that I hadn't left the tent since we went to sleep and he hadn't either. Once he sat up and realized what I was saying, he agreed that it was weird. He stepped out of the tent with our camping flashlight and then looked around in the woods for anything, but then came back in and told me that there was no one out there. We both kind of just accepted it for what it was and we confirmed that nothing was missing, so it was just a weird situation. But it got weirder. In the morning, after we were fully awake and ate breakfast, I decided that I wanted to show him some of the pictures that I had taken the day before on our hike. I turned on my camera and I went to the pictures, which immediately takes you to the last picture that was taken. There, on the screen, was a picture of myself and my husband sleeping in the tent. The timestamp was around 2 in the morning on the night before, which seriously scared the hell out of me. I immediately showed him the picture and I mentioned the whole tent door being open thing. I was panicking. He, of course, told me to calm down, but then I told him that whoever it was that had opened our tent was able to reach past me, grab my camera, and then take a picture of us without me noticing, because my camera was right by my head. I don't think the weight of what could have happened really hit him, but it was definitely apparent to me. If this person was any more of a psycho, I likely would have been dead. At my request, we ended up packing all of our stuff and heading out to the office for the campgrounds to file a report. They took the info and then probably did nothing with it, but at least they were aware of the situation. This was the one and only time that I have ever been camping, and I don't think I will ever feel comfortable doing it again, mostly because I don't know if this person had malicious intent or if this was just some dumb prank or something. But either way, it scared the living hell out of me. I've always been the kind of person that likes to take night drives. The roads are less congested and the world seems to settle into a settling calm, and my thoughts drift freely as I navigate the dark, quiet streets. I have one drive, however, that changed a lot of things for me, one that sort of ruined things for me and made me realize how close to death my simple little drive got me. It was about 2 in the morning and I was returning home from a friend's house. The drive was a smooth one. I knew it like the back of my hand. I was just drifting along with my headlights piercing the darkness, the radio playing softly in the background as I kept on down this seemingly endless road flanked by dense woods on either side. As I was breathing in the cool night air as it blasted in my face through the window, I noticed a car stopped on the side of the road with its hazards flashing. I kind of paused mentally for a moment thinking, should I stop? It was really late and I was alone, but the idea of leaving someone stranded in the middle of the road like that just didn't sit right with me. I decided to stop just ahead of the car, a safe distance away from the stranded vehicle. A man stepped out of the car and I noticed that he was limping slightly, but a look of relief spread across his face as he approached my window, so I assumed that he did need my help. He looked a bit disheveled and he was wearing a dirty shirt and some old-looking sweatpants. Nothing about him was screaming red flag. He just looked like he chose to dress lazily that day, or maybe he just didn't have a lot of money. "Hey, thank you so much for stopping. My car, it broke down." His voice trembled a bit from what I assumed was the cold. "Is there any way that I could ask you to give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" I hesitated a bit, torn between wanting to help this guy and that nagging feeling that something was a bit off. "I could call a tow truck for you." I figured that I should at least offer that to see if that would be enough. The guy sighed and looked around for a moment and then shivered. "I appreciate that, but that would take too long. It's seriously freezing out here. Please, just a quick ride?" This is where I started to feel a bit guilty. It was pretty cold and he was definitely not dressed for the weather. I hesitated, but then decided that it was a quick ride down the road, so I let that part of me that wanted to help out win. He got in, thanking me profusely and then directing me to a gas station a few miles down the road. After he gave me the directions, he just sat there silently staring out the window. I glanced at him occasionally, noticing that he was clenching his hands, sweating quite a bit, and just looking a bit unsettled. This kind of bothered me since he said that it was too cold outside, but now he's sweating? A bit strange, but I just figured that I would get him to the gas station and it would be over. We finally arrived at the gas station and he thanked me and got out of the car. His voice was still a bit shaky. He then shut the door, and as he was walking away, I noticed something on the floor of the car. I was about to roll down the window and call out to the guy to tell him that he dropped something. But when I clicked on the cab light, I noticed what it was on the floor. It was a knife, a small kitchen knife, smeared with blood. After a second or two it clicked. He was holding this knife in his pant leg. That's why he was limping. It had fallen out during the trip, and I guessed that he just didn't notice that it wasn't there anymore because he was walking towards the gas station. I immediately grabbed my phone and I called 911, telling them that I just gave a ride to a guy that I think may have stabbed someone. I had to explain the whole situation, and as I was doing so, I thought about the car. I realized that he was in the seat, but I didn't see him driving. I just saw him get out, and he didn't want me to call a tow truck, which made me think that his victim could have been in the car. Well, to wrap this up, I drove back in the direction of the car with 911 still on the phone, informing them where I was going, and I told them that I would wait for the officers. I had to give them all the information that I could, what the guy looked like, what he was wearing, everything that he had said. And I will also note that there was no one in the car, so I was wrong on that thought. They took the knife and they took the car, and I was questioned a lot about the whole thing. After a while, I think they were satisfied that I wasn't involved, but they told me that they would call me if they had any further questions. I have literally no idea if they ever caught the guy. I did get called in again for some more questions, but the questions seemed really vague, like they didn't know where to take the investigation. I do hope that they caught him eventually, and I hope that they found whoever it was that he had stabbed. And to this day, I cannot shake the visual of that man as he got out of my car. I will remember his face for probably the rest of my life. And with all this said, I hope that he and I never meet again. Okay, so this just happened to me and my buddy over the weekend, and I wanted to share this here. I am a 22-year-old man, and I have been living with my grandma since I was about 11. And now that I'm a bit older, I have been able to take care of her as her health has taken a downward slope. However, she is still able to get around on her own at home and is still fully there mentally. So sometimes I go out with some friends for the night just to kick it. Sometimes there are recreationals involved, but we stay out of trouble. I couldn't imagine doing something to disappoint the woman that has raised me. So, anyways, this was one of those nights where Curtis and I met up at our local spot to enjoy a night of no responsibilities and no one depending on us to do something. Our go-to spot was behind a building that had been abandoned some time ago. There was a narrow alleyway that connected it to some kind of doctor's or dental office, but it closed at normal hours, so there wasn't another person in sight. We would sit back there to smoke and bullshit for hours before we finally would leave. That night, we got on the topic of food, and as it goes, we started craving some of our favorite junk food. We made our way out through the alley and to the nearest gas station, and once we were satisfied with our purchase, we went back to our spot. Walking through that alley was normal for us. We walked to that spot from his place since it was close, and that way, a parked car at an abandoned or closed building wouldn't alarm anyone. Being in that alley in the dark didn't really scare us, especially when we weren't alone. It may not have been the best place in town, but we knew how to take care of ourselves. Not to mention, it was an unwritten rule that if you kept to yourself and you mind your own business, no one would bother you or say anything to you. So, when we were walking through the alley and we saw a lanky and scruffy-looking old man, we didn't think anything of it, and we kept our conversation low and did not make eye contact. But as we passed the guy, he let out the low, "Hey!" So, we slowed our pace, but we kept walking and looked back at the guy. He held up his hand as if he was greeting us and asked if we had any smokes. I've been there before, so I stopped and pulled out one to give to him. He then lit it with a matchbook he had, thanking me, and as we nodded, we continued on. A pretty simple reaction that we thought nothing else of. We then got back to our spot and started talking and screwing off again, when we saw that same guy walking out of the alley and towards us. We weren't going to really be able to hide what we were doing, or rather smoking, so we just sat there, waiting to see how this would play out. The man approached and asked if we had any extra that he could smoke too. If it kept the guy from snitching on us, I was happy to share, so I gave him some and he was actually pretty cool. He asked us some general and not too personal questions, like if we hung out there a lot and how we found this place. He even told us some interesting stories that he knew about the building we were behind. He seemed totally fine while we were talking. But then he dropped his head like he was in deep thought. We sat in silence for a minute before Curtis and I started talking to each other again. Going on like there wasn't a third person sitting there with us. Everyone has their own things that they are trying to work out, so I felt it best to let him sit there and not interrupt him. But as we are talking, he started muttering to himself, but there was nothing we could make out. After this continued for a bit, the guy slowly looked up and was staring right at me. Thinking he may have just had something he wanted to say, I looked back at him and just said, "What's up, boss?" "You shouldn't be here." I was confused at first, partially annoyed, thinking we were about to get some dumb lecture from some random guy about wasting our lives. But then it turned to confusion when I started thinking about how he's been sitting here with us the whole time too. What exactly was his whole plan here then? Curtis and I looked at each other and he asked the man, "What do you mean?" "This is a dangerous place. You never know what you might encounter." Still feeling annoyed and confused, I made a comment about him being here too or something to that effect. That's when, without breaking eye contact, he smiled at me and said, "I know. I've seen bad things happen here. I know things that you couldn't possibly understand." Curtis started talking about how he was killing the mood, and I agreed with him. This was supposed to be our time away from everything else, and now we got this stranger in our self-claimed spot talking about things that made no sense. We made a motion to each other to just get up and leave when the guy once spoke again. "I know things about you, Isaiah. Things that you don't even understand about yourself." Now, when we're out doing what we were that night, we rarely actually use each other's full name. It was either us calling each other C or I, or one of the nicknames that we'd given each other. And I can guarantee you that night that we never said our names around that guy. So, how did he know my name? I stood up and I asked him how he knew me again. And without as much as a flinch, the guy looked up at me smiling and said, "It's easy when you have my eyes. Would you like to see into them too?" I hadn't noticed before, as I had no reason to pay much attention to what he looked like. But as I stood over him and the single light from above us lit up his face, I noticed his left eye was glossed over and still, unlike his right eye. It was a fake eye. Call me a jerk, but normally that stuff I wouldn't even notice or care about. But between his cryptic talking, knowing my name, and the night now feeling tense, I was pretty unnerved by this. Curtis looked at me and basically just motioned that we should go, and I agreed. And as we started walking away, he continued to sit in the same spot, not looking at us, and then said, "The night will always find you." We picked up our pace and got the hell out of there. We went back to Curtis's house to try and shake off the bad vibes, our high already ruined. And shortly after, I just went home and to bed, hoping that that guy was just off and that I would never see him again. Everything was fine the next day, and even for most of the week, until I was walking home from the gas station It felt like I was being stared at, and typically, I just got this annoyed feeling. You know that kind when you want to look at someone and you want to say, "You got a problem?" But this time, I was feeling more on edge. My fight or flight was kicking in, and I started looking around all over. That's when I saw him, on the other side of the street, standing next to a bus stop. It was the same man. I stopped walking, and I just stared at him, as he was clearly already staring at me. I didn't do anything, but stood still until he lifted his arm to wave at me, smiling. I just picked up my pace to get home quickly, and thankfully he didn't follow. I told Curtis about it, so we've been avoiding our normal spot, not wanting to run into him again. So far, neither of us have seen him, but I don't want to take any chances. I don't know if this guy had bad intentions, if he was just trying to scare us, or maybe he was crazy. But whatever it was, I did not like the vibes that I got from that man. I'll update you if I do run into him again, but to be honest, I hope I won't have to. A bunch of years ago, I matched with a guy on Tinder. I was a freshman in college, and I just got out of a relationship and was having fun. I matched with this guy, male and 24, and we can call him D. He was a little odd, but we had similar interests and we went to the same school, so I thought, why not? Well, the red flags started rolling in immediately when I said I would go on a date with him. Of course, the fact that he was much older isn't lost on me as an initial red flag. At this time, I didn't have a car, so D offers to pick me up. But then he tells me that he is not in town, but that he would leave his grandmother's funeral early, which was at a minimum 5 hours away, to just come and pick me up. He showed up in sweatpants, a wife beater, and flip-flops, which struck me odd because he said he was coming from a funeral. We hadn't made plans just to get a bite to eat and hang out. Since he had been out of town, he asked if it was okay if we stopped to pick up his dog. He had left his dog with a friend. I like dogs, so I was like, no problem. It's dark and we pull up to an apartment complex, and he leaves me in the car and then comes back with a golden retriever. The dog immediately starts growling at me, which had never happened to me before, so I start feeling a little weird. D doesn't say anything about the dog's temperament. Because we have the dog, he wants to drop him off at his house, so this feels logical to me, so I just agree. When we pull up to D's house, he asks if I want to come in, and not wanting to sit in the car, I do. The moment that I walked in, I immediately knew that it was the wrong choice. The house is trashed. There's garbage everywhere, trash bags full along the front entry, bottles and wrappers on the couch, and just general crap everywhere. D lets me know that he has a roommate, but that roommate isn't home. So I assume this is to imply that the mess isn't his. And after brushing the trash off his couch, he asked if I want to sit and play chess. I had expressed that I was interested in learning, and he seemed more than happy to help me learn. This, too, was a mistake. D begins to explain the game to me, and it isn't fun first date explaining. He has gotten very serious and is showing me each piece while telling me what it is, what it does, and how it moves. D then begins questioning me over each piece, which most I get wrong, and every time that I get one wrong, he yells at me the correct answer and then tells me to try again. He got more and more frustrated, and it made me very uncomfortable, so I suggested that we pause chess and do something else. Dee suggested watching a movie, which is fine with me. The idea of us leaving and going to get food seemingly forgotten. Dee tells me that we can watch a movie in his room and I oblige. But then he explains that he has to put clean sheets on the bed. I had assumed we were moving to his bedroom because it may have been cleaner. But when we go in, it's not, and there is no TV in his room. He proceeds to put Iron Man 2 on his phone to have us watch. We watch for about 10 minutes of it before things got sexual. I won't tell you strangers the details, but short story short, we didn't have sex, but other things went down. I will say those things were consensual. After they occurred, I was feeling really off about the whole situation, so I told him that I didn't want to have sex. D was confused, but he didn't push it at first. He said fine, and we watched maybe 5 more minutes of the movie before he said he didn't want to watch the movie and more. He started complaining and asking me why I didn't want to have sex with him, and I simply said that I wasn't in the mood anymore. He then began pressuring me to tell him exactly what it was about him that made me feel that way. At this point, we had moved from the bedroom back into the dirty living room. You might be thinking, seems like a perfect time to leave. And I thought so too. But this is where things start to get scary. As if he knows that I'm thinking about how I'm leaving, he explodes and begins to scream at me. This is a 6-foot-something man screaming in the face of a 5-foot-nothing young girl. Of course, I'm internally freaking out, but I'm trying to make sure that I don't piss him off anymore, but also not agreeing to anything. For the next 5 to 10 minutes, Dee screams at me about why I don't like him, why I don't want him, and continuously asks what's wrong with him and to tell him. I tried to placate him as best as possible, saying the old, It's not you, it's me. And, No, I don't want to leave. Again, this man is my only ride home, and I'm truthfully not sure exactly where I was. Though, I did have my phone and Google Maps, but I did not have Uber at that time. D finally calms down when he believes I'm going to stay, and then he suggests that we try playing some video game. I was in full internal freakout mode trying to make sure that I was playing the part of the interested date because I was terrified that if he felt that I wanted to leave, he would freak out again. We play this game for a while, but then out of nowhere, D starts getting upset again. He started yelling about why no one likes him, why no one wants to get to know him, and why no one loves him, saying that he has never had a girlfriend and all of his dates had been one-night stands. Again, I placate him with I don't know. Lots of girls are just snooty like that. At this point, I'm saying anything and everything he wants to hear. He even starts crying about how his mother never loved him and telling me very deep dark things about what his mother has said to him and treated him. After he finally calms down once more, he then gets up and goes to the kitchen to fix us some drinks. Now, if you're anyone with a brain, you're thinking absolutely not, which was my exact thought at that moment. I declined his multiple offers for a drink. He asked if instead of alcohol, I wanted water. And of course, I declined that too, feigning that I wasn't thirsty at all. I stayed at his apartment until about 1 a.m. because I was sitting next to him, terrified to 1. Ask him to take me home, 2. Say that I would walk home, and 3. Figure out how to get an Uber. I had been trying to download Uber on my phone without him noticing, but then it asked for a card information, and that was too hard to do without him noticing. So around 1 a.m., I yawn very loudly and I say, Oh wow, it's 1 a.m. My roommate's going to be so worried about me. I laugh, as if my roommate would be stupid to worry, and that I hadn't been watching the clock since he picked me up at 9 p.m., then said, I'm so tired. I should get home soon. Again, I was super scared that he would freak out, but he didn't explode. He just looked at the clock and said that it's late. But I was not taking any chances, so I said, Oh, I have a great idea. If I get to bed soon, I'd love to have breakfast with you on campus. I was hoping my offer convinced him that I was intending to see him again, and it did. He seemed very happy at the prospect of it and jumped up, walking me out of the house and to his car. The drive back was excruciatingly long. The ride was completely silent and neither of us spoke. It was only a 10-minute drive, but I could have sworn he slowed down every time we got to a particularly dark area or the underpass. Dee dropped me off and I smiled and made a good show of being tired yet excited to see him tomorrow. He offered multiple times to walk me to my door, but I declined every time, and I said that I didn't want to bother him and that I would see him tomorrow. I walked myself to the building, and the moment that I got around the corner, I sprinted so fast up the stairs and to my door before he could change his mind and follow me to my door. When I got in my dorm room, I genuinely felt like I had just escaped a serial killer. Even now writing it makes my heart race a bit. I never met up with him, but he begged me for multiple days after to meet up with him again. He even asked to pay me $20 an hour to sit near me in the library. I declined, obviously, and I only ever saw him once after at the gym on the campus. He didn't see me, and I just left immediately. I've thought about Dee occasionally since the date, and I wondered if all those girls he had one-night stands with had the same experience as I did. I still sometimes wonder how many girls there were after me. So Dee, let's not meet again. A few years ago, my husband had to go out of state for a business trip for about a week. We had twins that were about 18 months at that time, and they were our first kids, so it took a lot out of the both of us. Previously, I would just go with him on his trips, but it becomes a lot harder with children, so we agreed that it was best that I stayed home. For work, I actually helped a friend with her small business of house cleaning, so I worked when I wanted, which made it easier for me to be able to stay home with my boys. However, I also get anxious about being home alone. I lived in some very bad places as a kid, so I constantly feared that someone would break in while I was home alone and that something bad would happen to me. That unfortunately followed me as I got older, and now I don't like being alone for more than a night. While he was gone though, my mom invited me over to her place for the week, so that way she could help me with my boys and also spend time with them, and that I would also have someone to talk to. The only thing was that she lived about 4 hours away, so I would be making a mini road trip with my 2 boys and my little dog. The first night alone was not pleasant at all. I put our air mattress in our boys' room, so I wasn't alone and slept there. Those things are not comfortable for more than a few hours. With little sleep that day, I went about our daily routine of making breakfast, went to the doctor's appointment, picked up some groceries and a prescription, and then went to see a friend as to have less time alone. I will mention that the part about going to my mom's was very last minute and not planned out. Later that evening when we got back home, I was making something for dinner when my mom had called. As we were talking and I was telling her about my concerns, she offered to have me come stay the rest of the week. I had planned to go out there first thing tomorrow morning, but I figured that it wasn't too late being around 6 or so. And after eating, I called my mom to let her know that I would head out there tonight. The anxiety in me thought that 4 hours alone tonight was much better than 6 more whole days, so off to packing I went. I got a few outfits for myself and the kids, since I would be able to do laundry there, and I got the car all packed up with our stuff, and then the dog, and then the twins. The one thing that I failed to realize was that while it was only 6 when I started, we ended up not leaving till a little after 7. I also did not sleep too well that night, so I knew that I was going to need more caffeine. After picking up some coffee, we were on the road. We were probably about 2 hours in, or close to that, when I had to stop to use the restroom and grab something to snack on to keep me awake. I remember coming up to this gas station that had a small bar and grill attached to it, so I felt comfortable knowing that there were going to be people around. I let the dog out first while I stood next to the car. Then after putting the dog back in, I pulled the boys out, locked the door, and then I headed inside. There were a few rowdy people on the other side though, most likely drinking, so it was pretty loud. Random laughing here, yelling and clapping, echoed into the little gas station. After I checked out, I started getting the boys buckled in. I find it easier to carry one in one sling while carrying the other in the car seat. That way, I have at least one free hand. So I sit Evan down on the seat while I put Ian back in his. I have a little hatchback, so I find it easier to walk around on the other side rather than reaching over them. As I went over to buckle Ian in, I heard the music from the bar get louder as someone opened the door. Out came 2 people, a man and a woman arguing very loudly. I can't remember what about, but they were loud enough to make me look over. I continue buckling him in and then go around the other side to get Evan strapped back in. And from there, I hear them yelling again, and I look back over to see her punching him in the chest. I finished getting them secured, and I did a fast walk over to the driver's door and got in. But before I continued, I decided to text my mom and husband to let them know how much longer I had. While I was doing this, I started hearing more yelling, but this time, it was things like, "Let go of me!" Thinking that it was the same couple, I looked up to see that they were not within my view. I chalked it up to them moving away, and that it was none of my business, and I started to set my phone back up with a GPS so I could head out. As I start to pull out of the parking lot, I'm startled by my passenger door opening as a woman is screaming help and then jumping in my car. She quickly locks the door and starts screaming at me, "Go," and then crying. I didn't know what to do at first, and I screamed something back that I probably shouldn't have, but then I took off. The gas station was right off the highway, so it didn't take long to get back on. I didn't know what to do, so I just drove while this woman, who I didn't know, sobbed in the seat next to me and screamed every once in a while. My boys are wide awake at this point, also on the verge of tears, so I tried comforting them the best that I could. I don't think this woman realized that I had kids in the car by the way that she looked back at them. She apologized and then explained that this guy that she had just met was trying to force her into his truck and that she was screaming to let go. It was not the couple that I saw earlier. She said that I could drop her off at the next exit and that she would find someone from there. But as I got over to the exit, there was a black and yellow truck sitting at the intersection with their lights off. Unfortunately, I didn't know who this person was or what they were doing, until the girl started screaming that it's him. Not knowing what else to do, I blew the yellow light and then went straight back onto the highway. I know it was stupid, but I thought that at least if a cop saw it and stopped us, he would keep going. This guy quickly did a burnout to follow us as well. Noticing he was behind us, the girl starts screaming and crying more, now making my kids cry. I was more terrified at that moment than I was being home alone, and now I regretted leaving. Not knowing what to do and on the verge of tears myself, I tried telling the girl to calm down as she was upsetting the kids. When I saw this guy get right on my ass and flash his lights, I was now in tears, thinking that this is how my life was going to end. When we started coming up to an accident, there were lights everywhere. The far left lane was blocked, and I knew this was our chance. I quickly shot over the 2 lanes, honking and holding down my horn, and I swerved over to the shoulder. I have never seen a cop run up to a car faster. We're all inconsolable and trying to explain what happened when the cop had us get out of the car. And once a little calmer, we explained that the truck was following us and was trying to kidnap her. He got as much info as possible and put it in bolo for it. After getting more information, the cop offered to take the girl home and to follow me for a bit to see if the truck showed up again. I called my mom and husband first to calm me, the boys and the dog down a bit, and then agreed to have the cop follow me for a few minutes as a peace of mind. The woman hugged me so hard and thanked me for not shoving her out of the car, and also apologized for putting us in danger. I know it was terrifying, but I was also glad that I was there for her because who knows what could have happened. We drove a few miles with no issue, so he had me pull over again and let me know that I would be on my own again. At this point, I was wide awake and just ready to go to my mom's to crash. The last hour to hour and a half or so seemed to fly by, and after arriving, I quickly crashed. I hope they ended up finding that guy because that could have ended a lot worse, and I'm thankful that the police were where they were at that time to save us from something worse. Unfortunately, now I have a slight fear of driving at night. The story took place back when I was in college. I had a lot of friends that liked to party, and while I wasn't the type that liked to drink or do stupid things, I was the type to make sure that my friends got to and from the party responsibly. Basically, I was their designated driver. I would drive them to the parties, sit around, and then drink soda until they were drunk off their asses, and then I would drive them back home. It may sound like an incredibly boring way to spend your college years, but I honestly had a lot of fun with it. I'm not an incredibly social person myself, so just kind of sitting around and watching people make themselves look like idiots was my idea of a fun Friday night. This situation occurred at one party that was particularly rowdy and had a lot of people that I didn't know, which usually happens when the parties were off campus. I was sitting in the corner with my Dr. Pepper in hand, and I was talking with another girl that was completely trashed. She and I were having a conversation about my education, something that she seemed way more interested in that than she should have been. When one of my friends comes over to ask me if I can take one of his friends home, they were insistent that it was just down the street. I usually don't play designated driver with people that I don't know personally, but I also didn't want this guy struggling to get home if he needed a ride. I reluctantly agreed and said that as long as my friend was vouching for him and that it wasn't too far from the party, then I would take him home. I got up, followed them out to the front door, and he shouted to some guy named Greg, telling him that I would be taking him home. They said their drunken goodbyes, and I walked over to my car, which I should add was a late 90s Dodge Caravan. After they were done talking and telling each other how much they would miss each other, Greg walked over and smiled at me, asking if this was the car. I nodded, said yes, told him that this was the one, and then got in the driver's seat. He, for some reason, opened the sliding door and then hopped into one of the back seats. I was curious, but if there's one thing you don't ask a drunk person you're taking home, it's why they chose to do mundane things. He gets buckled in and I pulled onto the road. I then ask him where he's headed. He tells me an address that's about 5 blocks down the way, literally a straight shot and only a few minutes away. And as drunken people often do, he starts rambling about random things. He tells me that his name was Gregory and that he was named after his grandfather. He tells me about a dog that he used to have as a child named Bucky and how much he missed him. He then tells me about his sister and how she runs a beauty salon in New Mexico and how he and his mother never really got along. This guy is seriously telling me his life story within the span of 1.5 miles. I then pull up to where he wanted to go and I let him know that we were at his house, just in case he didn't realize it yet. And he just kind of sits there and stares at nothing. After a few seconds of really awkward silence, he literally starts to cry. Out of nowhere, he tells me that he's sorry. I have no idea why he's sorry, and I tell him that he doesn't need to be. And after sobbing for a few moments, he tells me that I was the nicest person that he has met, and that he was going to miss all of this. Once again, I'm just sitting here silently, and he's telling me how much he's going to miss everything out here. He then tells me why he's going to miss it. He drops in with, I'm about to go to prison for a really, really long time. I just kind of sat there and nodded. And he, of course, continues, I made a mistake. I accidentally assaulted my ex-girlfriend, so I have to go to court tomorrow and I'm going to go away for a long, long time. And as he finished telling me about what he did to her, he starts to chuckle and stare at me in the rearview mirror. He smiles and tells me that I kind of remind him of his ex and that he hated her. And after a few more moments, he shrugs and tells me that he appreciated the ride and that we should go get lunch when he gets out of prison. I just agreed and nodded along until he got out and got to his door. And as soon as he entered his house, I let out a huge sigh of relief. The entire time he was staring at me and telling me about what he's done, I felt like I was holding my breath. This was the last time that I gave anyone a ride that wasn't one of my immediate friends. And I hope that I literally never meet Gregory ever again. This seems like the right place to tell this story. It happened back in 2013. It was about 8 to 9 o'clock, and I was on my way home from a pal's. I was sat upstairs at the back of the bus. There was only me and one other person on the top floor of the bus, and he was sat near the front on the opposite side. When I got up to get off the bus and walk from the back towards the stairs, he called me. I don't remember exactly how he asked, but he was asking for a lighter. I walked up to him, going through my pockets, and I told him that I had matches, and I handed them to him. He took them off of me and just stared at them for a good few seconds, and then handed them back to me and said something along the line of, don't worry. The time it took for him to decide to not use them felt very strange to me, and the eye contact before and after just felt intense. I walked down the stairs thinking, what the hell was up with that? And then I got off the bus. I told a couple of people how weird it felt and described what he was wearing, a zip-up black hoodie with a knockoff Hardy-style tiger on the chest. Well, fast forward about a week, and there's a fatal stabbing on my bus in my city. A young girl on her way to school was stabbed to death on the top of the deck of a bus. Stabbings are pretty common in my city, but a young girl being killed on her way to school, well, that's big news anywhere. They show a photo of the suspect being arrested, but you can only see the back of his hoodie. And straight away, I think that's the same exact Ed Hardy knockoff, and I start wondering if it's the guy that I had seen. When they released more photos of him from the front, I knew that it was him. The scary thing is, it transpired that he had recently been let out of a mental health facility. He hadn't been given any support and had been sleeping rough on buses. I've had many interactions with mentally ill people and some dangerous individuals, but this is the one that stays with me. Even though the interaction wasn't much, it felt so strange. I always wonder if he was seeing how I reacted when he asked me, hence why he didn't use the matches. Who knows? It's just a sad story, really. Rest in peace to the poor girl who was murdered. Her name was Christina Edkins, and she was 16 years old. Me and a couple of friends like to go urban exploring. It started out when we were kids. There was a house down the street that had been condemned after the old lady that lived in it passed away. Me and my friends, Andre and Stacy, who lived on the same street as me, talked about going in there and looking around. So, one night, we agreed to take a look, and we found a few treasures and then safely left. But from there, it definitely sparked our interest in future explorations. This made up most of our summers. We would find other small houses, shacks, or even old buildings that may have been abandoned or gutted after a fire or something. I bring this up because it's ultimately what led us to these following events. After graduation, Stacy moved out of state for a job offer, while Andre and I still lived close by. Keeping in touch with us, Stacy always called us to talk about the life where she lived and that we needed to come check out her new place. She always knew what to say though to really tie us in. She said that she was purposely looking for places for us to explore, and then she found out that there was a really old school that has been closed for decades about 2 hours from her. After she sent us some pictures from when she passed by it and then looked up the directions, we were convinced. So a few months away from summer, we started making our arrangements to head out there. With summer vacation starting, Andre and I drove out to her place, preparing to be there for about a week or so. Upon arriving, Stacy greeted us and then got Andre set up in the spare bedroom, and I offered to take the couch. That night, we caught up over dinner and she started showing us more pictures that she had taken from the outside. She wanted to go in, but she decided to wait till she had us with her because she knew that we'd be interested. The school sat in the middle of an overgrown field, and from the satellite map, it looked like there was a small shed or house a few yards away. There was a fence surrounding it, so we were definitely going to be trespassing. So this should be the part where I say we shouldn't do this, that it was a stupid idea, and that we should only go to places open to the public. But I didn't. We basically brainstormed what old tools and equipment that we wanted to bring with us, packed everything up, and then settled in for the night. The next evening, we headed out to the location. We wanted to go later on so there would be less traffic around and hopefully less people likely to report us. We took Stacy's car since it had local tags, and then we parked it off the side of a gravel road next to the property. The fencing wasn't anything fancy, just chicken wire basically secured to post. There wasn't even barbed wire above it, so we bent the top of the wire down, hopped over, and then proceeded to the entrance. The door was barely a door. It was only on the top hinges, and the bottom part looked like it had been crumbling away. There was a big piece of thin wood in front of it, but it was only nailed to the top, so you could easily bend it up to slide under it. This was our way in, and upon entering, you could tell that the air was stagnant. You could smell mild to old wood, and maybe even that smell of decay, like the smell a lot of old buildings start having. If you do this or start doing it, you'll recognize that smell. Most, if not all of the windows were boarded up, so you could just see the light of the sunset peeking in the cracks. We put on our mask because you never know what you could be breathing in, and then we grabbed our flashlights and headlamps and started figuring out where to start. There were 2 floors and 1 set of stairs to the right from what we could tell. We started on the first floor, of course. We walked to the left to see 2 classrooms on one side and the gym and cafeteria on the other. We entered the first classroom. Most of the desks were still in their place. There was a bookshelf in the corner with some heavily damaged books and old toys on it. The pages in the book were all stuck together, most likely due to water damage, as the window right above it was broken out and poorly boarded up. There was still string hanging above the chalkboard for like a party or banner of some sort. It was interesting to look at, and even though we didn't go to the school, it still brought back some good memories from those times. As we were looking around, we started hearing a scuffling sound coming from above us. Now, this isn't our first time, as mentioned. We've made rules for ourselves that if we ever run into trouble such as cops, animals, or other people, a lot of places are bound to have animals living in them. Not a lot of people are going to bother going in there, so they don't have to worry about danger. You just have to give them their space for the most part. You may run into squatters, and as long as they're not violent, you can usually just walk out without much interaction. Well, as for police, if there are trespassing signs, then you know the risk you're taking. We've only run into them twice, once as a teenager and they just escorted us home, and the second time, they suggested that we leave due to the structure not being safe. And with that being said, we just go quiet for a second to see if we heard anything else, or some talking maybe, accompanying the sound. We heard nothing, so we assumed it to be an animal and then just moved on. We walked over to the gym to see what we could find. There was a basket in the back with some deflated dodgeballs covered in a blanket of dust. Stacy found an old doll that she ended up putting in her bag to take home. She said that it reminded her of an old doll her mom, or maybe her grandmother had, but to me, it was just creepy looking. As we continued to look around, we heard more shuffling upstairs and then paused. This time, we heard what sounded like a really weird meow. Andrew made a comment about that not sounding like a cat, while Stacy argued that it was. It sounded enough like a meow to me at that time though. We then made our way over by the stairs, where there also appeared to be an office for maybe a principal or a nurse's office and a faculty room. It was starting to get a little darker, so we decided to head upstairs before it was too dark, so we could check out what was up there, and then we could make our way back down to the offices. As we headed up, we could hear more noise, and now it sounded like it was coming from one of the back classes. Stacy was interested in finding the cat, while Andre was hesitant. He had a point that we did have to be cautious in case it had rabies or was just aggressive, so we at least convinced Stacy to hold back some. We went into one of the rooms closest to the stairs when we started hearing some whimpering, like a small puppy, but this one, it definitely didn't sound right. Stacy and Andre agreed, but Stacy thought maybe the dog was just ill or scared. And after a little back and forth, we opted to check what the sound was coming from so we could all relax and explore more. We started heading towards the back when the meowing started again. And this time, it legit just sounded like a person meowing. I remember Stacy staying back a bit while I entered the room, followed by Andre. It was another classroom, but appeared to be for younger children, like a nursery. And in one corner, there were maybe 6 or 7 cribs stacked on each other to make like a sectioned off room. Of course, that would be where the sound was coming from too. As we walked in further, we turned our flashlight to point it into the corner. And that's when we saw it. We saw a full-grown man crouching naked in front of us. Embarrassed, Andre and I turned around and I apologized for intruding. And as I was about to say that we would leave, the dude started barking at us. Stacy was asking us from the doorway what was happening when Andre started laughing and shouting about a crazy guy living here. As we started walking back, and while Andre continued to poke fun at the guy, his barks became louder and more aggressive. I told them that it was best that we just leave when Andre yelled, "Hey, look out!" And before I could register what he said, this guy has jumped on me and he was scratching at my back. I tried to turn over, but this guy had to be at least 200 pounds, so it was a struggle. Thankfully, Andre ran over and punched the guy in the head, which caused him to stumble back a bit, enough for him to help me up. I stood there for a second looking at the sky as I tried to gain my composure back, when he proceeded to crouch on his hands and feet and then growl at us. Stacy started yelling at us that we just needed to leave, so we started walking quickly away when I looked back to see the guy walk out of the room, still on all fours. He started kicking back his legs, and Andre shouted, "Oh, hell no!" And the guy started running for us. I have never seen a human run so fast on his hands and feet. It was terrifying. We got to the stairs, got to the bottom, and I jumped from the second to the last stair or something like that, and my foot went through the floor. So once again, I am falling to the floor with both of them yelling at me, and the guy was closing in. I remember Andre yelling at Stacy to pry open the door, and he helped me up again. And right as we got to the door, the dude had fallen from the top of the stairs to the bottom. I kid you not, it was like he just fell over the side and landed in front of us, nearly scaring the hell out of me. But he looked like he knocked himself unconscious. I stared at him for a second to see if he was still breathing at least. The guy was just skin and bones. I could see his spine clinging to his skin, and his arms and legs looked frail and thin. You could even see his cheekbones nearly protruding in his face. He was terrifying looking. Stacy yelled at us, so we made our way to the door. We got out and made sure that we didn't lose anything too important and weren't hurt, and we started making our way to the fence. As we were climbing over it, we saw the man again. This time, he was standing on the school entrance by the door, just staring at us. He wasn't moving or barking, still on all four, but just watching. We didn't waste any time after that though. We ran to the car, got in, and locked the doors immediately. We looked up and the guy was now howling. We went to grab our phone to take a picture, but the guy quickly ran back inside, and we never saw him again. So yeah, that scared the hell out of us for the night. We went back to our place and had a few beers to try and calm down some and laugh it off. We were debating on if we should call the cops to get this guy help or if we would be worse off for trespassing. Andre thought that it was probably someone really messed up on drugs and found a place to call home, but it was just terrifying. It hasn't stopped us from our adventures, but we did add that to our rules, that if we find weird people, we leave ASAP. I am trying to convince them to go back there with me next summer so we can see if the guy is still there and maybe get some pictures for proof. So, did we run into a really messed up guy? Or do you think there was something more to it? Back in the early 90s, when I was about 10 years old, I had a really creepy close encounter with someone that honestly could have ended a lot worse than it did. And if I had been a bit more gullible, it likely would have ended really badly. At that time, I honestly did not comprehend the potential danger of the situation. But as I've gotten older, it clicked pretty hard how unsettling this experience really was. As mentioned, this was back when I was about 10 years old. My parents both worked during the day, and most days when I got home from school, I would be in an empty house for hours until my mom was able to leave work and then get home. They trusted me to be responsible enough to take care of myself. I was the type of kid that liked to just spend time in my room, playing my Super Nintendo, instead of being a problem for other people. We also lived in a neighborhood that was pretty much just a bunch of old people, so it was relatively safe. So honestly, it never seemed like a big deal to me. On this day, I had been home for maybe half an hour. I'd finished my homework and I had turned on the TV to watch something. I had grabbed a Pop-Tart for a snack when I thought that I saw something outside of the living room window. It was a pretty big window and it faced to the west, so if you walked by it in the afternoon, it would cause a bit of a shadow into the room. I glanced over for a moment to see if I could see anything, and I saw a man, probably in his late 40s, as he looked older than my dad. He was slowly walking along the sidewalk in front of our house. He seemed to be studying the house, staring at the ground, the roof, almost like he was seriously trying to memorize how our house looked like. But then it got creepy. As I was watching this guy analyze the exterior of our home, I watched as he put his face up to the glass with his hand cupped around his eyes. He was absolutely looking into the window and trying to see if there was anyone in the house. And, of course, he saw me sitting on the couch, just staring at him. He smiled and waved, and then I watched as he walked over to the front door, put his hand on the doorknob, and tried to push open the door. Thankfully, my parents had told me to keep the door locked at all times, and I was pretty obsessive with doing so he wasn't able to get in. When he realized that he wasn't going to get the door open, he walked back to the window and started knocking. By this point, I was having a mini panic attack in my mind, screaming about how this was some weirdo trying to get into the house. But I kept trying to calm down and tell myself that he must have been a neighbor or something. He kept knocking on the window rapidly, just tapping on it with his knuckle for several moments. And then he started on the door, really, really hard. At this point, I had no idea what to do, so I walked into the kitchen near the front door and just stood there. Because I was so unsure of what to do, I just figured out that I could tell him that he got the wrong house and then to go away. I didn't open the door, obviously, but I did shout out to him saying, "Who are you and what do you want?" When I asked this, I could hear him laugh a bit and then say, "Could you open the door for me?" I said no and again asked who he was. He then said that he was a neighbor and that he wasn't going to hurt me. I may have only been 10, but I knew that this was a weird thing to say to a kid. You don't just tell a kid, "I'm not going to hurt you," unless you plan to hurt them. At least, not in this kind of scenario. I told him that if he was a neighbor, then he needed to come back later when my parents were home, which I now realize was a stupid thing to say, as this was me literally telling him that my parents weren't home. When I said this, he paused for a moment and then said, "Look, kid, I work with your mom. I'm a friend of hers. She'll vouch for me, so can you just, please, let me in?" Now, this was where things got a bit confusing for me. This man knew my mother's name specifically, and it's not a common name, so it wasn't like he could just guess a name and get it right. But I also knew my mother's co-workers. My mom worked at a hair salon, and she was one of the big names of the store, alongside my aunt, of course. They had about 5 employees that they worked with, and I knew all of them because I would always hang out there during the summer, and I loved all my mom's co-workers. And the thing is, all of her co-workers are either older women or younger ladies trying to break into the industry. This guy was neither of those. I mentioned that I didn't think that I could let him in and that he should come back later. At this point, he got pretty angry. He started banging on the door saying, "I know your mom. Her name is..." And then he says my mom's name. "You need to let me in right now." When he started getting aggressive, I ran over to the cordless phone and I hit the button to call the salon. When they answered, I told her who I was and told her that I needed to talk to my mom right away. I explained the whole situation to her, and she told me to hang up, go to the laundry room, and then lock the door, and then call the cops. She then said that she would be there in a few minutes. I did exactly what she said, so I ran to the laundry room and then I locked the door, and then I called 911, telling them that a guy was trying to break into my house. And after about 10 minutes, I heard my mom yelling my name, along with the voice of an officer, and I came out to see them standing at the door and looking at a pile of glass. Apparently, after I had run down to the laundry room, this guy had smashed the window in the front door and tried to break in. The officers took my statement, asking me a bunch of questions about the guy and what he looked like. I told them all that I could, and I told them that they knew my mom's name specifically, and they said that they would drive around to try and find the guy, but I have no idea if they ever caught them. My mom thanked them, and after all was said and done, she told me that I did everything right and kept telling me that it was all okay. I could tell that she was freaking out about it as bad as I was. And after that, I wasn't allowed to be at home alone for a few years. my mom worked with one of our neighbors, an older lady that was actually one of the lunch ladies at my school, and I stayed at her house until they got home every day until I was in high school. She was pretty cool though, and she always had food for me when I got there, so I didn't really mind. That day is something that has been burned in my mind, and when I was that age, I was definitely scared, but as I mentioned, I now realize how serious it actually was. I am thankful that, even at that age, I was smart enough to realize that this guy didn't want anything good. I have no idea how he knew my mom's name specifically. Maybe he looked at the mail or something. But I'm just glad that I trusted my instincts and that I was able to avoid a much worse fate. This story is mine, sort of, but it's more my dad's, so the entire thing is based on what he's told me. I was there, but I was just strapped to my little car seat in the back, and obviously, I was way too young to remember any of it. He told me about this way later in life, and honestly, it's terrifying. It's probably why my dad was always so protective of me and emphasized being alert and aware of our surroundings. Hell, when I turned 17 and got my license, he always told me to take the main road and avoid the back roads. From what my dad had told me, it was a pretty normal morning. He needed to go run some errands, so he was taking me to my grandma's house. I was just sitting in my car seat and then watching the back window as I always did, completely unaware of anything. He was driving down a relatively quiet road with trees on both sides. My grandma lived on the edge of a suburb, so there were a few spots that you had to go through that weren't heavily incorporated. He was there, just cruising at speed, when a man jumped out of the woods and then ran in front of my dad's car, flailing his arms wildly. Naturally, my dad slammed his brakes, barely avoiding hitting this guy. He said that he could see that this guy looked terrified, like he was running from something or someone. But something about it didn't seem right. Something about the situation was off. His instincts were screaming at him that this guy wasn't just some random dude running across the road. The guy didn't say anything to my dad. He just limped over to the side of the car and made the motion of rolling down the window. My dad, curious as to what this guy's explanation was, cracked the window and asked if he was okay. The man didn't respond. The two of them just stared at each other's eyes for several silent seconds. My dad said that his heart was pounding, like his mind was saying, "Nah, get out of here." He was prepared to drive off at the first sign of trouble, and sure enough, trouble arrived. As soon as he turned to look back at the road, out of the corner of his eye, he saw two other figures starting to emerge from the undergrowth of the woods on the other side, and without hesitation, my dad stomped on the gas and the car lurched forward, leaving the three strangers standing there in the middle of the dust cloud that he kicked up. He said that he could see them in the rear-view mirror, and all three of them just stood there watching as he drove off. He didn't stop driving until we reached my grandma's house, where he said that he called the cops to report the incident. He wasn't sure what they were planning, but he gave them a description of the man and the location too. But the details were sparse outside of that, so we never did find out what happened with the situation or what that all was. The police never called us back too with any details, and my dad didn't press the issue. He was just happy to have avoided what was undoubtedly heading towards a dangerous situation. And even today, years later, My dad sweats every time he tells the story, which really tells me how much it scared him. My dad is a good guy, and he will stop and help people on the side of the road. But this was definitely a sobering reminder that some people will take advantage of those willing to stop. So it's important to trust your instincts and be hypervigilant about your surroundings. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. I would also like to give some extra love to my Patreon members, my channel members, and also my tippers. Thank you so much. If you would like to extend a little bit more support for the channel, don't forget to leave a like and a comment down below. If you would like to become a Patreon member, a channel member, a tipper, or even to buy merch, check out the links in the description below. Again, thank you. And I hope you stay scared because your fear feeds me.